My name is Lesley Kelly. I'm a first year MA student specialising in ceramics here at NCAD. My presentation will examine the language of abstract forms and the process of deconstruction and what that means. My guest speaker is Ed Kuzyk, Head of Art Therapy Department and Visual Education at Crawford College of Art in Cork, and he will discuss art therapy in a little bit more detail. As artists, we are driven by our need and desire to express our emotions and thoughts and ideas, and I feel we're very privileged to do so. But it occurred to me, what if you couldn't do that? Imagine you were an individual who basically had all of their feelings and ideas suppressed by circumstance. Now imagine if that individual became a group and that group became a society. All of us, a society without expression for me would just equal apathy, and I'm sure none of us would be sitting here today basically. So having thought about that, I realised that the creative process can pick up where language has left off. Abstract forms, symbolic of human emotion, are the aesthetic translation of a creative process that allows the artist to re-engage with the instinctual self. But how does it do that? And I wanted to find out basically. And how does it benefit the artist, the individual, and our society? So I began an exploration of these ideas in a series of undergraduate work that represented a personal response to the positive and negative elements that we're exposed to on a daily basis. And this was realised through the abstraction of a baby's bottle. After hearing a conversation between a man and a child on the street, I was inspired to make a social comment on how we are fed, in every sense of the word, physically, emotionally and socially, and how it shapes us. The baby's bottle was a form that I used to translate my idea. So I began making a series of bottle forms, and without realising it, I was making them in groups or families. Even when I was photographing them, I was putting them into groups, because one on its own just didn't seem to work. The forms are coiled, a method that I hadn't used before, but I was instinctively in tune with. And as each form evolved, it became obvious that the form had become a physical departure from the literal translation of the baby's bottle. Using abstraction to make an open statement was a conscious decision, and each form was now open to interpretation. I made 14 in total, but exhibited 10. So I then arrived to write my MA proposal, and I came across this quote by the ceramicist Kuczaj, and it intrigued me because he was suggesting something that I wanted to achieve. So after completing the body of work, the undergraduate work, I made a conscious decision to investigate abstract forms. Through my research, I wanted to explore the conscious and unconscious dialogue between clay and maker. And if externalizing the internal, can you re-engage with the inner self? I started literally making work intuitively. I wasn't concerned about form, I wasn't concerned about concept. By trusting the clay, the space became defined through folds, curves and manipulated lines. And it was a process of stripping back to the essential in order to understand forms that are layered in meaning but have been removed from the recognisable. The abstract form has the ability to conceal or reveal the emotional or an intellectual thoughts of the maker. Or they can direct the viewer onto new or old paths of association. This way of working was fantastic. It really allowed me a sense of freedom. But I really needed a form of reference. So again, I returned to the work of Kuczaj. These are two pieces of his work that I absolutely adore, basically. I think they're beautiful. The forms are thrown, cut and reassembled. The vessel itself suggests containment, but the fluidity of the line still allows the viewer to be involved. His suggestion that the work should be a vague memory of the real thing was something that still resonated, that I wanted to actually make in my work, or bring across in my work, basically. I started working with slabs of clay, and I quite simply just let them fall or fold, and I allowed them to take their own shape, basically. This directed me onto my current series of work of abstract forms. These forms are open forms that can be pressed, folded, pulled and directed. They can be placed together, stacked on top of each other, or stand individually. I think I've arrived at a point basically where I can really develop these forms further. So it's actually a starting point to continue on, basically. For me, the abstract form offers an alternative. The process of deconstruction and the creation of abstract forms can bring truth out from its concealment, but I constantly question the value of that process, and this is what has driven me, basically. Do these interpretations have a value? If I gave a lump of clay to a child, would their unconscious mind produce similar forms? And was it the process or the form that actually communicates? So my research actually led me to art therapy. I felt it was a profession that confirmed the value of the process, and has played an important role in giving the individual the opportunity to assessing and understanding the unconscious mind. Abstraction and art therapy both form a visual narrative that not only directs the process of deconstruction, but also the interpretation of that process and the interpretation of the artwork. Both the artist and the individual can become physically and emotionally involved in the experience. The process has the potential to externalize the internal, and the emergence of inner experience offers the opportunity to re-engage with the inner self, or the instinctual self. At this point in my research, I'm understanding the relationship between the creative process and the individual, the artist and the abstract form, and that can create a dialogue and develop a conversation that will contribute to the preservation of the instinctual self within our society. Now, on that note, I'd like to introduce my guest speaker, Ed Kuzyk, Head of Art Therapy and Continuing Education at Crawford College of Art in Cork. Thank you.
It feels as if I've been wired up to one of those shop assistants in a shoe shop. You know, I feel as if I ought to be saying size 11 in black, please. Can I just thank Lesley very much for inviting me to today's conference, and great privilege. She contacted me in kind of early January and kind of said a little bit about what she was doing, and asked if I would maybe say something about art therapy, and I kind of said, yeah, that's absolutely fine. And it's just to admit that kind of over the course of a couple of weeks, kind of some of the information was coming through about, I mean, at the time I didn't really ask what I was coming to. So over the course of the last few weeks, you know, so the information about the conference has been coming through, and I suddenly had this dilemma. I was thinking, like, how does art therapy fit within this? And I saw the catalogue, and it was when I started reading the catalogue, I started hearing some of the descriptions in terms of the intentions of the artist, the craftsperson, in terms of what they were making, that it started to make sense. So what I'm going to be, in a sense, exploring with you, and it is very much exploring with you, is in a sense the nature of art therapy, but also kind of one of the theories within art therapy, which actually specifically looks at kind of the idea of the object, because there is a relationship, and it actually came up quite succinctly this morning in the first presentation when Aileen was talking, she gave the example of one of the, I'm not sure whether it was a student, I can't remember the artist's name, who'd made the necklace with the prongs coming out, and Aileen said that she'd asked her why she'd made it, and she said it was about keeping people away. And part of me thought I could see that within an art therapy session quite easily. So thank you to Lesley for inviting me. So what I want to kind of explore with you is kind of like the nature of art therapy and its relationship to the object. But first of all, if I can... yeah. Now, this is kind of blinding your sight in some ways, and it's an awful slide, but the reason it's there is because one of my colleagues, a guy there called Rupert Cracklow, who's, I'm sure he won't mind me saying he's in his 70s now, but he was specifically involved in kind of the art therapy movement in its beginnings in the UK back in the 1960s, and he was one of the first individuals to take part in one of the first trainings in St Albans. And he now lives in the Borough, and he's done quite a bit of work with us, particularly in relation to kind of art therapy history in relation to the students' programme that we run. And he, in part of his presentation, he devised this slide, and he talks about kind of streams of influence in relation to art therapy. And in terms of the streams of influence, what he looks at is arts and art, literature, philosophy, mythology, religion, medicine, and science. And in some ways, this is a confusing picture, possibly to you. But in some way, I think it kind of probably succinctly represents, in a sense, the complexity of what we're in, or what I'm in, the profession itself, and kind of where we've come from. Because it's difficult to pick one specific point, one specific influence over anything else. And if anything, as a profession, it's certainly changing in some of its influences and some of its, and how it's responding to its history, because all the time, as well as looking forward, we're looking back and actually finding new kind of insights. But I suppose just to say in relation to kind of the development of kind of art therapy, which kind of parallels with the development within America at the same time in the 60s and the 70s. One of the main proponents, the first proponents, are just in the middle there, a guy called Adrian Hill and Edward Adamson. Adrian Hill was a kind of watercolourist of some note, and in his own convalescence, I think he was suffering from some illness, he kind of realised in his involvement in his paint work how he was responding to some of his own emotional feelings at the time. And also, this is post-war, just after the war, he was also very conscious of, within the hospital, of how returning soldiers, combatants from the war, who were given through kind of occupational therapy kind of artwork to do, how through their own artwork they were experiencing or re-experiencing certain emotional experiences. So he coined the term art therapy kind of in the sort of late 60s, early 70s. They followed after him a guy called Edward Adamson, a painter, who was invited into the Nethan Hospital, psychiatric hospital in London. And he was invited in by, I guess, an insightful consultant who invited him into kind of establishing a studio within the actual hospital itself. And so he literally established a studio with easels. And the patients' clients would come in and they would work away, and he would give some tuition. But he also kind of responded to the fact that the actual medium itself that they were involved in actually carried them on a process, which was about, in a sense, an inner exploration. But one of the interesting things that he kind of he says in relation to his work in the hospital, that he says, one of the things he says is that sometimes one of the most important points of the work that actually happened with the actual clients, patients, was them actually coming from the ward to the actual studio, and that was the biggest step. And it kind of hints at the way that kind of art therapy is developed in terms of particularly taking kind of its some experiences, particularly from psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. You see Freud mentioned there, and Jung. Jung particularly, who in some ways was possibly, could be called the first art therapist, used actually creativity both for himself and with his clients. And he would sometimes ask his clients to actually paint or create. And he had what he calls his own psychosis during his lifetime, his life. And for a period of time, he actually kind of spent just actually creating, both painting, but also actually kind of interestingly working in sand, actually making worlds as a way of actually trying to understand. Now, importantly, what Jung and Freud give us is kind of the idea of the unconscious. So at the turn of the last century, the idea of the unconscious comes into being, and the surrealists pick up on this as a way of actually kind of, in a sense, elaborating and investigating their own work and development. So we have these influences, and also there is outsider art as well, in the sense that for a long period of time it's been known that there are individuals who, without any formal art training, actually involve themselves in a creative process. Sometimes it's obsessional. But it means something. It allows them to exist in a world. And there are collections, the Prince-Swan collection and the Dubuffy collection. They were both Prince-Swan was a psychiatrist, and he became very interested in the work of his clients and, in a sense, their creativity. And there were some particular kind of clients. Wolfie is one who produced a phenomenal amount of work over a period of time. And I guess what it illustrates is the innate nature of creativity itself. But even for those people who don't go through a formal art therapy art training, that creativity is important. You know, and we know that through children. If you want a definition, then I'll give you this definition. Form of psychological therapy that utilises a creative medium to allow an additional way for individuals to explore and understand their experiences in a safe and therapeutic environment. That's a fairly kind of, I guess, safe kind of description for you. I think the importance within it is that it's about a creative medium to allow an additional and an alternate way for someone to explore whatever's going on for themselves at that particular time. What it's not instead of words. And I think kind of one of the interesting things within kind of the work that we do is that often when you're actually working with quite vulnerable people or individuals who have quite specific experiences, that what we're looking at is actually allowing them to developing their own emotional language. And I think that language kind of, in terms of what they develop, is both a very personal one, but it's a very intimate one as well in relation to the therapists they're actually working with. And what we're trying to do is to kind of frame it within a kind of, and we say psychotherapeutic framework, put it within a framework which gives the client a sense of control, understanding, empathy from the therapist, but also kind of a contract in which they understand what they're involved in and what they can expect from the actual therapist themselves. We're trying to create a safe therapeutic environment, and that's very important. One of the kind of major concepts within art therapy, and this comes from an art therapist primarily called Joy Chevrin, who was a trained artist who then went on to become an art therapist and who's gone on to do psychoanalytical training. She comes up with the idea of the triangular relationship. So within the room itself, you have the therapist, the client, and then you have the production of the image or object. Within a normal kind of, well, sorry, not normal, but within counselling or psychotherapy, if you take out the third point there, the image or object, you have a dialogue, an interaction between the actual therapist and the actual client. By introducing the possibility of this, and it is just a possibility because that's the client's prerogative as to whether they actually choose to do it or not, but by introducing that, we introduce a way of someone actually being able to explore and look at whatever it is that they have has been going on for them in terms of their own life experiences, which are presumably giving them some degree of issue at that time. Looking at and exploring that in a different way. And it's almost, in a sense, bypassing something, because what you're actually saying to the client is, can we explore your issue in another way, in a metaphorical way? So rather than talking about your depression or talking about your anxiety, it's almost like, what would that look like if it was a landscape, if it was a colour, if it was a shape? So you introduce to the client a way of actually then investigating and researching their issues in that metaphorical way. And I think this is important where the actual kind of language comes in. Now what Joy Shepard takes it a stage further, and it kind of links into Freud's workings and theories in terms of kind of the idea of transference, in terms of what the client... Traditionally, transference has been seen as kind of the clients going back to the relationships that they would have had from a parent or authoritative figure. Traditionally, it's been seen as that. But basically, what it is that the transference is the client's stuff. So, as a client, if you're all my therapists, I see you as very authoritarian, whatever, and I talk to you in that way. I'm very angry with you because you're controlling me. And what follows from that is kind of a counter-transference, in the sense of you as a therapist, or I as a therapist, react to the client, reacting to me. And in a sense, this is the stuff of therapy. Now, within the image, it introduces that third thing, because the client will actually react to the images that they actually make. And I, as a therapist, will actually react to the images that the client makes. And the example I'd give you is a guy who I worked with who had very little control over the space that he was actually in. He was extremely loud, and he could be quite problematic in terms of behaviour. And sitting him down at a table, he would put the piece of paper in front of him, and he would get a palette of colours, and he would start painting. And as he was painting, he would be talking to me. So he had no connection with what he was actually doing. And by the end of the session, the paint was going down the table, going down the leg, it was going on the floor. And my actual reaction to that was, Jesus, somebody has to clean this up on a basic level. And it's me. You are just pouring the paint out. You have no concept of what you're doing. And you're leaving this mess for me. What he was doing was trying to find a way of being with me. So if I had reacted to him in the sense of, you can't do this, you can't do that, okay. Now there's a degree of control that you have within a session in terms of the safety of the client and yourself. But what you're trying to give the client is kind of room to experience something, and then for us to actually reflect on it. So what we were able to do is to actually reflect on what he was doing and the consequences of pouring this paint on, because we would get to the brown stage, when you mix every single colour, and the only colour you can get to is brown. And it feels like shit. Quite literally. And that's what kind of we're left with. So actually working with him on that, we got to the stage where he was able to actually control and actually kind of work within the boundaries and space of the actual paper itself. Now, in a sense, that was a goal, but that had to be a goal from him, not from me. And obviously, kind of any change within the kind of session itself is important, but you know, we're looking for change outside. I'm going to, we'll show you just, I've just got 2 examples and some work later on, but I just want to go on, if I may, to a guy who was in amongst that slide, a guy called Donald William Cup, who was a paediatrician, a psychoanalyst. And he came up with the, and it comes from object relations theory from Klein and Anna Freud. And it's the idea of the transitional object and transitional space. And where it starts, or where we suggest it starts, is kind of the infant in relation to the mother's breast, the mother. And the way that the actual child is weaned, separated from that first contact. And what he suggests is that kind of that the infant, when they're attached to the breast, when they're being fed, they perceive that breast as part of themselves. Which, maybe that's hard to think about, but if you actually think about the child in the womb, you know, encased within that womb for 9 months, it's then, we are then, I am then suddenly drawn out into the world. And so I have to make sense of the world. And I suppose one would also say I'm still trying to make sense of the world. And maybe that's maybe in some ways that's what we're all trying to do. But the child is trying to make sense of its reality. And for a time it perceives the mother's breast as being part of themselves. And he suggests also that the mother in those, particularly in those early times, but maybe possibly further as well, the mother perceives the child as part of them as well. So the two, in a sense, are enmeshed. And he talks about the kind of the space in between, and he calls it the potential space. And why it becomes interesting is because, as a paediatrician, he observed quite closely the interactions between, particularly mothers and their children. And he realised the importance of the thing called the transitional object, which to you and I would be the teddy bear, the soother, the toy, that the mother gives to the child as a way of actually comforting. If you have children, or if you can actually just think back to your own childhood, you can actually think about the actual kind of objects around you that kind of at that time were important or significant to you. So in terms of the kind of transitional objects, he's thinking about the teddy bear, the soother, and such forth. And there's a really interesting example of the way that children use objects in terms of this transitional object in one of his cases. And he talks about a case where a mother brings a child. I think the child's about probably 4 or 5, 3 or 4. And in the room that he has, he's got his chair when the mother's sitting there. And then over in the corner, there are play materials. And the child clings on to the mother and doesn't want to leave the mother, but realises that in the corner there are play materials and becomes quite intrigued by these play materials and wants to go over. But the mother, talking to him, doesn't want to leave a seat. So the child thinks. And then he sees some string. So the child goes over to the toy area, picks up this ball of string, comes back to the mother, then ties one piece of string around the leg and holds on to the other end, and so can walk over to the play material and actually play away. You know, I mean, string is a really interesting thing because it connects, it binds, it has a whole different set of properties, but it has its wonderful metaphorical kind of possibilities for us. And I think it's just a wonderful example of the way that kind of we imbue objects that are around us with characteristics, needs that we actually have. I had a niece who had a rug, a child's baby's blanket, and it was one of those ones where the top was kind of satin. And so she had this as a child, and she carried it around with her everywhere. It was called Ruggy. And when she was, I think she was about 13 or 14, Ruggy was probably about 2 centimetres square. But Ruggy went with her everywhere. And they called into the local town, to the supermarket, and bought some things and went home. And she realised that Ruggy had disappeared. So, causing the most amazing scene, she insisted with her mum. They went back to the supermarket and searched the supermarket for Ruggy. They didn't find Ruggy. And she got over it. But for 14 years, this piece of cloth represented something very, very specific. And I think kind of, for me, what it represents is kind of, in a sense, kind of what how we embody kind of objects and images with characteristics and, in a sense, our own needs. Now, kind of Winnicott here says, the intermediate area of experience, so that kind of central part, unchallenged of its belonging to inner or external shared reality, constitutes the greater part of the infant's experience, and throughout life is retained in the intense experiencing that belongs to the arts and to religion and to imaginative living and to creative scientific work. He goes on to say the infant's transitional object ordinarily becomes gradually decatheted, especially as culture interests develop. So it's interesting, and he's suggesting a way that kind of like culture, the arts, become a transitional object in itself, or transitional space for us to engage and actually understand our reality against the reality outside of that. 8 plays. It was during the process of putting this together, I kind of remembered about this plate, this dish, which was my grandmother's. And my mother gave it to me kind of, I don't know how many years ago. And I actually I have a real fondness about this plate. I'm not quite sure what the fondness is about, and whether it's about a memory or about a connection with my grandmother. I don't particularly want to get into kind of therapy now, but there is a connection with this plate. And what was interesting was last week was that my kids came over, and they're all grown up, and we sat down to breakfast, and I suddenly realised that my daughter, who cooked a kind of eggs, bacon, whatever, suddenly came to the table with them on this plate. And she said, "Oh, this is a lovely dish." And my immediate reaction was, "What the hell are you doing with this dish? This is my grandmother's. If you break it, it will be gone." And I didn't say that to her, but what it reminds me of is the way that we have objects around us, artifacts, that we actually imbue with values, with experiences, with smells, with moments in time that are actually very, very important. During my own work, I did a lot of work with loss and bereavement training, and one of the kind of interesting ways of actually getting people to understand what a loss may or may not be about is to actually take something from them physically. And it's kind of interesting when you take something of value, whether it's a ring, whether it's a photograph, whether it's something that somebody's kind of given you, how kind of in the absence of it, that kind of you actually go through, albeit in kind of a shorter period of time, a kind of grieving process. Similar reactions in terms of confusion, where have I left it, where has it gone, to anger, to sadness, and then to reconciliation that it's not going to return. But it's just very interesting the way that objects, in a sense, kind of give us that those feelings. What I've slipped in here is kind of a piece of work of my own, kind of, which was done quite a number of years ago, because I was kind of thinking about the object in relation to kind of artefacts around us, but then as an artist, kind of the actual connections and the resonances and what I put into that work in terms of myself. And this was done kind of quite a long time ago, in the mid-80s. Why I came back to it again, which is in relation to being here today, was that when I was doing my degree, I had to travel from Bristol to Newport in Wales, and I caught the train. So there was this, in a sense, displacement, because things happened in college and I went home, and then I didn't have a studio there. So I got very interested in the work of Joseph Cornell, the American artist, and his constructions. And I started making constructions myself. And it's interesting in looking at it, because on the right-hand side, which is quite hard to make out, there's a picture of Freud, kind of cut up. And the kind of there are pieces there from an old newspaper found behind a mirror, and it says last week's Rex. So, and there are, in a sense, these two different journeys going on. And I kind of look at it now, and it's the sort of thing that's been given away and come back to me as an object, but it feels very precious to me. But in showing it to you, I'm showing it to you with a degree of control. In the sense that you're viewing it as a witness to, if I call myself an artist at the time, certainly an artist, a piece of artwork. But it's different from that was produced, or could be produced, would be produced within an art therapy session. And I think it's that sense of control, and also kind of a very conscious level of understanding in terms of where it's being witnessed. That's very important in relation to that. These are just two examples of some work with a client. I worked a lot with individuals with learning disabilities, just conscious of the time. And just briefly to say that this guy in his 20s had been in a hospital for nearly 16 years, had a very, very small degree of learning disability, could communicate extremely well, was extremely verbal. But one of the things that his issues were about control. And he felt very kind of angry, actually, that when his father had died, his mother had remarried. When his mother had remarried, that she'd placed him in hospital because she felt that she couldn't care for him. And there was a lot of resentment in relation to the stepfather. And the initial stages of the actual therapy were very much about him trying to kind of understand who I was and where the control lay, and testing, which is important in relation to clients and therapists. You know, the client needs to test out this kind of new environment, this new possibility. So in inviting him into kind of the sessions, he became really initially very interested in the fact that he was producing artwork, and that someone, okay, I wasn't actually saying to him, because within art therapy we wouldn't necessarily, well, you wouldn't say as such, you wouldn't compliment people on their production of what they've actually done from an aesthetic point of view. What we normally do is kind of encourage people in terms of their involvement in the actual process itself and give a lot of encouragement around that. And in the initial stages before this image, they were very diagrammatic, and he kind of, for a time, thought, God, this is really good, I'm going to put these together to make a book for NCAD to raise money, which is kind of interesting in terms of his own perception of his own learning disability. This image is about him going home for the weekend, but his parents arrived late because they'd had a puncture on the motorway, and he became really angry. But he didn't show it to the parents, and he went home and came back, and he brought this, in a sense, he brought that experience to the session and produced this image. And what's interesting, although the colour's quite poor there, but all of the activities around the head and the hands, and this is very much what he presented. And he kind of explored with me kind of what happened, and that he went home, but he felt that the reason they'd had the puncture was because they didn't want him to go home. And that's what he was left with. What I could do is actually kind of encourage him and say that he had worked really well from the point of view of that not having been shown at home and evolved into kind of a behavioural kind of difficulty with the parents, but he'd actually held on to it and actually brought it to the actual session itself. And that was really important. That was a really significant point in the actual therapy after a couple of months. And this is just another image further on. And this is actually his stepfather. And what's really interesting about this is that the second figure is his mother. So there's more importance in relation to his stepfather than his mother, because he was trying to work out his relationship with his mother, with his stepfather, who he viewed as being authoritarian. Interestingly, he was an ex-headmaster. But he viewed him as being authoritarian, and he viewed him as being, in a sense, the individual who pushed him out of the home itself. But what was interesting in relation to this image, it's difficult to see, but his body there is made out of, it's coloured, it's wax and felt tip. But he got into a process of layering, and he would put the wax onto the body and then cover it with felt tip, and then wax and felt tip. And what was amazing was that after a period of time he had a glass-like finish, which was extremely smooth to touch, and he was running his hand over it. And it was just interesting the way that the material itself had actually allowed him to connect with something, allowed him to connect with an aspect of his stepfather that he wanted to be part of, but didn't know how to do it. Because his normal way of working with relationships was to react to them, to want to be in control, because he perceived that other people were in control of him. He was very clever. If he had a disturbance, he would wait till the most junior member of staff was on before he did it. And he used to frighten the staff on the ward, not quite to death, but nearly, because he had a really good relationship with the consultant. Because he was really verbally articulate, and it really kind of freaked them out. But he, over a period of time, he became very involved in the images, and where the kind of notion of the transitional object becomes important about this is that within the therapy itself, what would normally happen is you would say to the client, I will look after the images for you. Literally in that sense, so they would go in a folder. Now, if the client wants to take them, that's absolutely fine. But they become a memory, they become a diary, they become artifacts, they become a reality, they become experiences, which within the process you can actually take the client back to. So kind of quite periodically you would say to the client, what about if we do a review? What about if we actually look at the images So you get the client to actually look at the images and actually just reflect on where they'd come from to where they are now. Were the stories still the same? Was the narrative still the same? Were the experiences still the same? What does it feel like now looking at this, where you are now? What's changed for you? So in a sense, kind of the art therapy gives this possibility of this process, which is really, really, really client-centred, which is really important, I think. But the images and objects that they produce become this collection, and they become a reality, they become part of the person. And I say they become part of the person because I've had experiences where people have become quite disturbed in relation to what's happened in relation to the image or object that they've actually produced. Where people have become, will re-experience very specific events and will want to destroy potentially what they've made. And to a certain extent you would allow them to do that. I would allow them to do that. And an interesting thing that kind of, in terms of what this folder and what this work begins to represent was, I was working with a client, with someone else. It was in relation to abuse. And it was this girl who was she was 16. And she had a fixation about Madonna. And she came one session and said, I've got a Madonna keyring. I want you to have it. And I said, well, I'd be really concerned if we lost the Madonna keyring, because it's obviously very important for you. I don't think I quite said it in those terms, but something a little bit more client related. But I said, I really feel that kind of like this is important for you, so maybe it's better if you look after it. And she became really insistent that she wanted us to look after this Madonna keyring. So I said, well, okay, well, you've got the folder, your folder, so what about if you leave the Madonna keyring in the folder, and then it's there for you next week, and you know where it is. So that's fine. So the following week she arrives, and she was brought by a carer. She came sort of bursting through the door and said, where's my Madonna keyring? Where's my Madonna keyring? So the carer said, she's been really upset because she's lost her Madonna keyring. So the carer left, and she was searching through the folder, and she found the Madonna keyring. There it is, there it is. And so what did that represent? What I think it represented was about, can I trust you as a human being with my experience of being abused? Can you hear my story and not leave the room? It was a whole set of kind of needs that she was expressing, and I think fundamentally it was one about trust. Can I trust you? Because for some of the people that we kind of work with, in terms of their vulnerability, they need to be able to trust. And I think one of the interesting things about art therapy is that kind of that we do work, art therapists do work with some very, very vulnerable people, and people who kind of normally kind of psychotherapy wouldn't look at, particularly in schizophrenia. And indeed in the UK now, in the NHS, it's recognised, particularly in relation to schizophrenia, as a recognised treatment in terms of being able to hold those actual clients. So that's just a kind of an example in relation to some of the kind of the work that actually kind of might happen. Just one thing, just going back to Winnicott, and I've just got it written here, and it's something that he kind of suggests, which I'll just read to you. And he goes on to say in his book, and the book that this is coming from is Playing in Reality, which is an excellent book. He says, a successful artist may be universally acclaimed and yet have failed to find the self that he or she is looking for. The self is not found in what is made out of products of body or mind, however valuable these constructs may be in terms of beauty, skill and impact. If the artist, in whatever medium, is searching for the self, then it can be said that in all probability there is already some failure for that artist in the field of general creative living. The finished creation never heals the underlying lack of sense of self. I think that's kind of an interesting kind of concept in relation to creativity and the artist or craftsperson. In a sense, what drives the artist to create? And I guess to some extent, if we resolved all of the issues that we have, maybe we wouldn't have that drive. I suppose it's probably important to say, because if that might sound somewhat depressing, that kind of, he doesn't deal with the rest of the human race and what they're having to deal with. So, in a sense, within therapy, we're trying to kind of allow the client to find a sense of self. But in a sense, that's the same for each of us as humans. And I think the artist is trying to kind of find a sense of self themselves. It was interesting, there was an interview on the BBC some weeks ago with Tracy Emin. I can't remember who the interviewer was now. And she, at one point, she said that the artist, being the artist, makes sense of a mad world. And maybe that's what the artist does. And I'll just take you back to, this is an image from, I think it was the Independent, after the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center. And it's just an image, not just an image, it's an image made by a child, a Lemiro girl, who painted the picture of the angel as a way of expressing thanks for being alive. She saw much of what took place and was really thankful that her family was safe. And there are just some really interesting images that actually came out after that attack from children in terms of their expression of what they experienced. And in a sense, it's a very raw expression, but it's a very real expression. And in a sense, that's what we allow within, we encourage within kind of the art therapy itself. I just want to finally come to this, and this is reading a book, Christopher Bolus, who's an American psychoanalyst, and in one of an edition of kind of reviews of his work, there was just this quote which I thought was really kind of interesting. It's by Philip Guston, and the actual chapter is by Greg Drasler, who's a painter. And he just came across this. He says, when you go into the studio to paint, everybody's in the studio. Your friends, art writers, they're all there in the studio, and you're just there painting. And one by one they leave until you're really alone. And then that's what painting is. They leave you where you've prepared yourself to be, to paint. I put in italics, or create. And then he goes on to say, there's nobody there, then ideally you leave. And I think it's a lovely notion of, in a sense, kind of Winnicott's idea of that potential space, that creative space that we get into when we actually start to work with image making and object making. Because there are times when we do that, we kind of transcend that kind of that reality, and it becomes something else. And the actual process has a life of its own. Jung kind of interestingly talks about active imagination and kind of actually working with the image. And there's a UK art therapist whose name is completely gone out of my head, who kind of like has worked with that in terms of actually talking, how you talk to the image. I think it was Paul Klee who talks about kind of like taking the line for a walk. So it's about that other reality that we have, which is about the space around us. And I think as kind of artists, craftsperson, the objects and artifacts that we make are about moving from that inner space to that outer space. And then who witnesses that? So I just want to leave you with that on that point, and just maybe to actually just think about, in a sense, what objects mean for you. Thank you very much.